The following story is one of death, disease, and the human cost of the trail. The Oregon Trail may conjure up images of golden sunsets, rugged adventure, and wagons marching westward across the open plains. But for those who actually made the journey, the dominant theme wasn't romanticism or glory. It was death, and it was everywhere. By some estimates, 1 in 10 people who started the Oregon Trail never made it to the end. That's tens of thousands of graves scattered across the prairie, most of them unmarked and long since forgotten. The most common cause of death on the trail wasn't violent attack or animal encounters. It was disease, silent, invisible, and relentless. We tend to think of historical epidemics like the plague or the 1918 flu pandemic as aberrations, events that were somehow more deadly than normal. But what's normal? What was the normal level of death before modern medicine? When we understand what was normal, we can get a sense of just how deadly the Oregon Trail really was. One way to estimate the baseline level of mortality is to look at the vital statistics of early American pioneers. For example, we know that during the 1840s, around 30% of children under the age of 5 died. That's because the leading causes of childhood death, things like bacterial infections and malnutrition, were widespread in pioneer communities. If a child was old enough to start school, though, they were probably going to make it to adulthood. Only about 6% of school-aged children died before they reached the age of 20. So if you were old enough to join the wagon train, you were probably pretty healthy. In other words, if you survived to your teens, odds are you would live a long life unless you headed west on the Oregon Trail. For every 100 people who started the journey, 10 would die on the trail. The journey to Oregon was dangerous regardless of your age, sex, or health. It was especially deadly for women, children, and Native Americans. Women made up almost half of all deaths, mostly due to childbirth complications. Of the 7,000 or so women who gave birth during the trek, 250 died, a mortality rate of about 3.6%. But this figure doesn't tell the whole story. While the risk of dying in childbirth was high, it was evenly matched by the risk of dying while pregnant. A full 3% of women who became pregnant on the trail lost their lives carrying their child to term. Once a baby was born, they faced another deadly hurdle, the first winter. Nearly 15% of all babies born along the trail didn't make it to their first birthday. For Native American families who joined the migration, the dangers of the trail were compounded by a lack of access to traditional foods and medicines. Many groups suffered horrific losses. The Walker family, for example, set out from Illinois with 72 members and arrived in Oregon with only 38. So why were the risks so high? One important factor was the physical environment itself. Much has been made of the hardships travelers faced: the scorching heat, freezing cold, and relentless rain. But these extreme conditions only took a small toll on human life. Travelers who succumbed to the elements were rare. More important was the impact of everyday conditions on health and well-being. Sleepless nights spent watching for predators, eating monotonous rations, and being confined for months to a rocking wagon were a constant drain on the body. But the biggest threat came from disease. We tend to think of pandemics as dramatic, unprecedented events, but death by disease was part of life for most of history. Diseases like cholera and typhoid fever killed just as many people in the 1840s as in the 1830s, and they'll continue to kill just as many people in the 2020s as in the 2010s. The only difference is that today we call COVID, but the same pathogens that killed pioneers were already killing people in the United States long before the first wagon train crossed the plains. And like today, there was no single cause of death more feared than cholera. Cholera is a bacterium that lives in water, usually brackish water in swamps or river deltas. Unlike many diseases, it doesn't need an intermediary like a mosquito to infect a human host. All it takes is a drink of contaminated water. The bacteria then releases toxins in the intestines, causing massive amounts of fluid to be expelled from the body. Victims become violently ill and die of dehydration within hours. Like most diseases, cholera wasn't picky about who it killed. It didn't care if you were young or old, male or female, sick or healthy. But cholera did seem to prefer certain environments. And few environments were more conducive to its spread than the wagon train. Most people drank from streams and rivers, often the same ones they used to wash their clothes and dishes or where they bathed. As spring turned to summer, the water grew warmer, creating a perfect environment for bacteria to breed. But the most likely source of contamination was the oxen, cows, horses, and other animals that traveled with the wagon trains. They would drink from the same streams and rivers and sometimes share them with humans. They would also relieve themselves in the same places. The animals themselves weren't to blame. Their digestive systems were simply passing along the bacteria that was already present in the water. But once a person drank the water, there was nothing they could do but wait to die. Families tried to protect themselves by boiling their water, but that only made things worse. Boiling water actually increased the concentration of toxins in the water because it evaporated some of the liquid. Then, when it was consumed, those toxins had an even deadlier impact. Some travelers believed the reverse was true, that unboiled water was safer to drink. By the 1840s, the idea that boiling water spread cholera had taken hold. But there was no scientific basis for this belief. Both boiled and unboiled water were equally deadly. Because cholera spread so easily, outbreaks were unavoidable. Whenever a traveler fell ill, everyone in the wagon train was at risk. Even if they didn't drink the contaminated water, they could still get sick by helping to bury the body. Burial itself was risky. Graves were dug near the campsite, sometimes only a few feet away from where people ate and slept. If the ground was too hard to dig, the body was buried in a shallow grave or even left on the surface. This not only allowed the bacteria to seep into the ground and contaminate the water supply, but it also attracted animals who then carried the bacteria with them wherever they went. One particularly brutal cholera epidemic broke out in the summer of 1849, killing 3,000 people, nearly 10% of the total number of migrants that year. Of the approximately 2,500 people who made the journey with the main wagon train, 250 died from cholera. The first case was reported in May. By July, the death toll was climbing by the hour. Dr. Thomas J. Dreyer, who served as a surgeon for the U.S. Army at the time, described the situation in his diary. From 10 o'clock last night until now, he wrote, "I have been constantly employed in the discharge of my professional duties. I have made 7 post-mortem examinations, and from 2 to 3 o'clock, there were 8 deaths. I have buried 21 bodies since I came here." The outbreak eventually moved on, but the cycle continued. Every year, cholera claimed victims along the Oregon Trail. The best strategy for avoiding it was to keep moving. Days were long and the trail was unforgiving. But a break in the journey might mean a break in the chain of transmission. So families packed up their wagons and moved on, sometimes traveling 10 hours a day, 60 miles a week. They raced against the clock, hoping to reach the relative safety of the Willamette Valley before the weather warmed and the disease took hold. Dysentery and typhoid fever were also common killers. They crept through the camps, spread by poor hygiene and close quarters. And washing wasn't always practical, and latrines were dug shallow and close to camp. Medical care was rudimentary at best. Most wagons didn't have a doctor, and even if someone had medical knowledge, the treatments of the day were often useless or worse. Bloodletting, which involved draining a patient's blood, was a popular treatment for everything from headaches to cholera. But it weakened patients and exposed them to infection, killing many of those who tried it. Today, we have vaccines to prevent and treat many of the deadliest diseases and antibiotics to stop them from spreading. But the Oregon Trail was nearly 200 years ago. And even today, basic preventative measures like hand washing and adequate burial practices are often lacking. Because of that, the diseases that killed pioneers still kill people around the world every day. And while many of those deaths happen in places we consider far away, some happen right next door. During the COVID-19 pandemic, more than 1,000 migrants died of viral fevers in Texas alone. The same rivers that carried pioneers to Oregon carry migrants to Texas, and both journeys come with a heavy price. The Oregon Trail is a stark reminder that disease doesn't care about borders or time periods. It only cares about bodies. If you want to learn more about the human cost of disease, check out our series on pandemics, including the episode on COVID-19, which has had a devastating impact around the world. In the early 1800s, a new and terrible disease emerged, killing thousands of pioneers heading west. Doctors diagnosed cases of bleeding, purging, and even shooting. Doctors recommended treatment with raw mercury or opium, which often did more harm than good. In fact, this deadly outbreak was caused by medical treatments. And in the midst of this crisis, two nurses stepped forward. They treated sick patients with fresh air, healthy food, and clean clothing. Today, we know that these practices seem simple, but at the time they were revolutionary. These nurses became known as the Angels of the Oregon Trail. But who were they, and how did they save lives? Let's find out. It was 1849, and the Oregon Trail was bustling with settlers hoping to make their dreams come true in the fertile Willamette Valley. It was hard, slow going for the thousands of immigrants who crammed into the wagon train. Each day, the oxen moved only about 15 miles, making the journey take months. The trip was dangerous and exhausting. The smallest accident could result in injury or death. Most of the time, the pioneers survived the trip, but along the way they faced many hardships and illnesses. When someone got sick, the doctor might recommend bleeding to get rid of bad blood. Mercury was often used because it was thought to help the body purge itself of impurities. However, this was not true, and in many cases, the mercury did more damage to the person. The doctors often didn't wash their hands before performing surgery or treating wounds. This led to infections that could end up being fatal. Accidents were the second most common cause of death. People were run over by their own wagons, which could weigh over 2,000 pounds. A simple misstep while climbing in or out, or losing balance while walking beside it, could be fatal. Children were especially vulnerable. One pioneer wrote, "The little ones cannot be trusted to themselves for one moment while on the road, as an ox cart is so heavy that should it fall upon them, it will kill them instantly." Another recalled that just the day before his party reached Fort Laramie, he saw a woman and 3 children crushed to death by a team of runaway oxen. Gun accidents were also disturbingly frequent. Firearms were carried for hunting and protection, but with so many people crowded into camps, a gun mishandled or misfired could kill someone in an instant. So far, we can see that the trip was hard and dangerous. Some people died from diseases such as cholera, while others met their end in accidents. But pioneers also died while crossing rivers. There were no bridges or ferries on most rivers, so travelers had to ford them. If the water was too deep or the current too strong, wagons would tip, animals would panic, and people, especially children, could be swept away. One immigrant later recalled, "I have seen more deaths by drowning on this trip than by any other cause." A mother with a babe at her breast, a young man, and a maiden were drowned within my view, all in one day. The banks were full of graves, but what happened to those who didn't die? How did the trail affect their lives? Even when death wasn't immediate, the trail exacted a heavy toll. Injuries like broken bones, infected cuts, and burns were common. A small wound could easily turn into a serious problem. Without antibiotics, infections spread rapidly and gangrene set in. Amputations were sometimes the only solution, often performed without anesthesia, using nothing more than whiskey and a sharp knife. Imagine this. You fall from the wagon and break your leg. There's no hospital, no ambulance. Just your family, a few dusty tools, and a bottle of spirits to numb the pain while someone cuts into you with shaking hands. Life on the Oregon Trail was tough and lonely. The isolation made it even harder. Travelers moved from place to place, never staying in one spot for long. They didn't know anyone in the vast wilderness, and there were very few towns along the way. Sometimes there were military forts, but most of the time there was no one around except other pioneers like them. They traveled in groups called wagon trains for safety. Trains usually had between 50 and 100 wagons and moved together for protection. But even that wasn't enough to keep everyone safe. The danger never ended. Disease and death stalked the trail, and the constant threat of attack by Native Americans weighed heavily on their minds. Living conditions were harsh. Settlers slept in tents or covered wagons, and food supplies dwindled. The only way to stay alive was to keep moving forward toward the Willamette Valley. By 1848, the threat of attack by Native Americans was less of a concern than it had been in previous years. However, settlers still lived in constant fear of disease, exhaustion, and death, and then the angel came. It was 1849 when 23-year-old Mary Elizabeth Spencer arrived at Fort Vancouver, eager to start her nursing career. She worked under the supervision of Dr. John Gant, a well-known pioneer physician. When the fort fell ill, she cared for them with kindness and compassion. Her dedication paid off, and soon word spread about her skills. She developed a reputation for healing people who had lost hope. People began calling her the Angel of the Oregon Trail, but her skills weren't the only thing that stood out. Mary revolutionized nursing by focusing on fresh air, healthy food, and clean clothes, instead of relying solely on mercury and opium. Although some doctors opposed her methods, most agreed that her approach helped patients recover faster. After working in Fort Vancouver for a few years, she continued helping people along the Oregon Trail until 1857. During her time as a nurse, she cared for more than 600 patients, saving countless lives. Mary wasn't the only angel. At the same time across the country, 25-year-old African-American nurse Maria Weems was caring for pioneers traveling to Oregon. She learned the trade from her mother, who was a former slave. Together they joined the California and Oregon Trail and arrived in Oregon Territory in 1853. There she provided medical care to pioneers for more than 25 years. Like Mary, and Maria preferred fresh air, diet, and cleanliness to mercury and opium. Her work was a radical departure from traditional medicine, but it saved many lives. She delivered more than 250 babies and treated countless illnesses and injuries. One woman who sought her help said, "She nursed me through a long illness, patiently and kindly. I owe my life to her tender care." Despite facing prejudice for being black, and Maria continued to help people until she retired in 1879. Both women were pioneers in more ways than one. They challenged conventional medicine and improved the lives of thousands of settlers. Their story reminds us that even in the darkest times, a single spark of kindness can make all the difference. Now it's time for you to become an explorer. What do you think life would be like if you had to travel by wagon train? How would you feel knowing that every day you could die from disease, exhaustion, death, or a Native American attack? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on our latest videos. Thanks for watching. What's something you think you could never do? Is there an activity so unpleasant or challenging that even trying it isn't worth the potential reward? When most people imagine the arduous journey along the 2,000-mile Oregon Trail, they picture the physical toll on pioneers: sunburns, blisters, aching bones and muscles, insect bites and infestations, dysentery, cholera, exposure, starvation. Those things are bad enough, but mental health, The toll that living in these conditions took on the minds of the pioneers is rarely considered, even though what we today call depression and anxiety were common among travelers. It was a different world with different terminology, so pioneers likely wouldn't have described themselves as depressed. They might have used terms like melancholy, low-spirited, in a bad humor, setting, or even crazy. But whatever they called it, the emotional burden of their journey along the Oregon Trail was very real. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this house. Today we are exploring how the Oregon Trail broke people's minds. Make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an exciting episode. In 2018, researchers decided to get to the bottom of the psychological impact of the Oregon Trail. How did travelers cope with the massive undertaking of crossing the country to reach the Willamette Valley? What kind of toll did it take on them mentally? To answer these questions, they turned to letters written by pioneers during their travels along the Oregon Trail between 1841 and 1869. This primary source provided an intimate look into the psyches of the travelers. Through analysis of the letters, researchers identified the major stressors contributing to mental strain on the Oregon Trail and how those stressors manifested in the pioneers. The first major category of stressors was time. On the Oregon Trail, time was a constantly ticking menace. There was pressure to start at the right time before the weather turned, but also to hurry up and follow the group to stay safe in numbers. There was pressure to travel at the correct speed to avoid being left behind or falling too far ahead of the group. There was pressure to arrive at the end of the trail before winter. Time was always either running out or being wasted, which created anxiety for travelers. Being late could mean a harsh winter in an unfamiliar place. Being early meant a potentially long and lonely wait for others to catch up. The pressure of time was constant and it affected travelers mentally. Another major source of stress was what we today call PTSD. Imagine starting a journey knowing that at any moment you or your children could die. That was the reality of life on the Oregon Trail. Travelers knew that death was always lurking around the corner, waiting to ambush one of the group. And when it struck, it was usually sudden and violent. In such an environment, fear became a constant companion, always present, always ready to pounce. Travelers couldn't predict when disaster would strike next, whether it'd be a deadly illness, an accident, or an attack from an animal or a person. This constant state of alertness took a heavy toll on their mental well-being. Another factor that contributed to mental strain was isolation. While traveling in groups, pioneers spent a lot of time alone. Days were filled with individual tasks like cooking, cleaning, taking care of livestock, and mending clothing. Evenings were often quiet too, with most people exhausted from the day's work. Some nights were filled with the sounds of snoring, coughing, crying babies, barking dogs, and howling coyotes. But other nights were unnervingly silent, and that silence could be deafening. There was little opportunity for socializing, playing games, singing songs, or telling stories. Even talking to your neighbor could mean the difference between sanity and despair. Travelers longed for connection, but the reality was that they were alone on a lonely trail. The next major factor that caused mental strain was conflict. Travelers didn't spend all their time in peaceful harmony, and disagreements were bound to happen. One particularly common point of contention was oxen. They were temperamental, easily spooked, and occasionally stubborn. Some travelers kept detailed journals documenting the mishaps and misadventures they had with their oxen, like when they escaped, gored each other, fell, broke wagons, or just plain refused to move. Oxen caused a lot of frustration, which sometimes boiled over into fights. Other common sources of conflict were limited resources, exhaustion, and the ever-present threat of danger. Lack of privacy was another major source of stress. On the Oregon Trail, personal space was non-existent. Travelers slept in close quarters with the entire wagon train. Families huddled together in their wagons with little room to move. Children shared beds with parents and siblings. There was no escape from the sights, smells, and sounds of camp life. And for women, the lack of privacy could be especially stressful. Menstruation and childbirth were seen as dirty, shameful acts. Women often hid their soiled bedding and tried to keep their conditions secret. Privacy was a luxury they simply didn't have on the trail. Finally, travelers dealt with uncertainty. Life on the Oregon Trail was unpredictable. Weather could change suddenly, forcing travelers to alter their plans. Illness could strike without warning. Supplies could run low, and encounters with Native Americans could turn violent. Pioneers couldn't control many of the events that shaped their journey, and that lack of control was frustrating and anxiety-inducing. Add to that the uncertainty about whether anyone would make it to the end of the trail alive, and you have a recipe for mental distress. But if mental health challenges were so widespread, why did travelers continue on the Oregon Trail? The answer is simple. They had no choice. Turning back wasn't an option. Most travelers had sold or given away almost everything they owned to pay for the journey west. Leaving the trail meant returning with nothing to an uncertain future. Staying on the trail meant a better chance of starting a new life somewhere out west. Travelers continued on for the promise of a better future, even if it meant enduring mental health challenges along the way. Now that we know the major causes of mental strain on the Oregon Trail, let's see how it manifested in the travelers. Travelers coped with the stress in a variety of ways. Some turned to religion for comfort. They prayed, sang hymns, and read scripture. Others found solace in nature, taking in the beauty of the mountains, rivers, and forests around them. Still others coped by burying themselves in their work, like writing a journal or mending clothes. Some travelers even found love on the Oregon Trail. Courtship wasn't off limits, and romance blossomed despite the difficult circumstances. But for some, the stress of the journey proved too much. They suffered mental breakdowns. These breakdowns often took the form of depression, which manifested in a loss of will to live. Some travelers simply didn't want to go on anymore. They wanted to give up and stay put. The final destination seemed meaningless when compared to the cost of getting there. In some cases, travelers literally gave up. They laid down on the side of the road, unable or unwilling to go on. They may have felt overwhelmed by the journey, hopeless about the future, or burdened by the constant stress and uncertainty. Fortunately for them, the wagon train didn't leave anyone behind. Instead, fellow travelers helped them get back on their feet. They assisted them physically and emotionally until they were able to continue on. Women faced additional stressors due to pregnancy and childbirth. Giving birth on the trail was dangerous. Some women died in childbirth. Infants were born into a world of dust, noise, and disease, and many didn't survive long. Funerals, when time allowed, were quick and quiet. Graves had to be dug fast, and shallow graves meant animals would sometimes disturb the dead. Some travelers buried their loved ones under the wagon tracks to hide the graves from scavengers, human and animal alike. Today, we recognize that what pioneers experienced on the Oregon Trail took a significant toll on their mental health. We understand that they faced immense stressors that would challenge anyone's well-being, and we acknowledge that many of them suffered breakdowns and struggled to cope with the journey. But their story doesn't end there. Despite the challenges they faced, pioneers pressed on. They pushed through the mental strain, the illness, the death, the grief, because they believed the end of the trail was worth the cost. They dreamed of a better life in the Willamette Valley, and that dream kept them moving forward. Which part of the Oregon Trail do you find most fascinating? What would you have found most challenging? Let me know down in the comments below. And while you're there, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an exciting episode. I would also like to say a special thank you to our supporters whose names you can see on screen right now. I'll see you next time. Why did they do it? Why leave the familiar streets of civilization for an uncertain journey over 2,000 miles of wilderness, knowing that only half would see it through? For some, it was land. They'd heard stories of free land, fertile land that could be theirs if they had the grit to make the journey. For others, it was freedom. They wanted to escape the crowded cities, the smokestacks and factory chimneys that stained the air, the poverty that seemed inescapable. Some just wanted a better life, a chance at happiness that seemed impossible back home. But whatever their reasons, they all had one thing in common, an indomitable spirit, a will to press on that defied the odds and conquered the doubts that whispered in their ears. "You can't do this," said the voice of reason. "It's too hard, too dangerous, too expensive," but the dream was stronger. The dream of land, freedom, a better life, that was stronger than the fear. But make no mistake, one day on the trail was enough to test even the strongest soul. The ruts and bumps of the wagon trail beat them and their oxen. Day after day, the prairie wind, it whipped at their faces, drying their skin and chapping their lips. The sun beat down relentlessly, turning the trail into a shimmering mirage and making every drop of water more precious than gold. Some days the temperature soared into the 90s, others it dipped into the 30s, forcing them to huddle around their fires, wrapped in every blanket they owned. And when the thermometer dropped below zero, it was a battle to keep going. Many a pioneer has woken up in the morning to find their breath frozen in their lungs, their blankets turned to ice, and the world painted in a layer of sparkling white. As the wagons rolled on, the landscape began to change. The lush grasses and wildflowers gave way to rugged canyons and rocky mesas. The rivers, once wide and plentiful, narrowed and deepened. The air grew drier and the days longer, and then it happened. The very ground beneath their wheels rose up to challenge them, not in a violent quake, but in a slow, grinding test of wills. Mountains, the Rockies, stood in their path, a wall of jagged peaks and winding trails that seemed to stretch on forever. Here, the air was thin and cold, the path treacherous. At nearly every turn, the mountains tested their courage, their determination, and their faith in the promise of the fertile valleys beyond. If the trail itself didn't defeat them, the skies often tried. Storms could arrive suddenly, catching the pioneers off guard. The sky would darken, the wind would pick up, and before long, the prairie would be pounded by hail, rain, or snow. In the open wagon beds, the travelers were at the mercy of the elements. Floods swelled rivers, washing away bridges and stranding families. Lightning split the sky, followed by thunder that shook the very earth. Tornadoes touched down, lifting wagons off the ground and tossing them like toys. Blizzards swept across the plains, blinding travelers and burying wagons under feet of snow. In the heart of winter, temperatures plummeted and blizzards raged, each gust of wind carrying the threat of death. The pioneers struggled against the elements, battling not only for their own survival, but also for the safety of their families and the fate of their dreams. Even when the skies were clear, there were dangers lurking above. The sun blazed down with a ferocity that made even the shade unbearable. Travelers were forced to trudge on, seeking refuge in the scant shade provided by the wagons or the occasional tree. The relentless glare bleached their skin, singed their eyes, and made every step a gamble against exhaustion and dehydration. But it wasn't just the heat. There were other things in the air, things that rode the wind across the prairie and brought with them the specter of death. Disease, cholera, typhoid, smallpox, and dysentery stalked the trail, finding new victims every day. No shelter, no fresh air, no privacy, the travelers were packed together in their wagons, sharing not just the cramped space, but also the germs that caused these deadly diseases. When the fever came, it swept through the wagon trains like wildfire, leaving behind a trail of suffering and death. The graveyards along the trails stand as silent, stark reminders of the toll that disease took on these hopeful travelers. Each headstone a story of a life cut short, a family's dream deferred, a promise of a better life that was never to be. But perhaps the greatest test of all was the loneliness. In Imagine being surrounded by nothing but endless fields of grass, broken only by the distant wagon train and the occasional lone rider on the horizon. Days blurred into weeks, the monotony broken only by the rumble of wheels on the dusty trail. There were no street lamps to light their path, no friendly faces to greet them, no shops or schools or churches to give their lives structure. It was a profound isolation that gnawed at their spirits and made the journey feel endless. The pioneers coped in different ways, drawing strength from their families, their faith, or simply the knowledge that they were all in it together. Some found solace in the beauty of the land, the vastness of the sky, the grandeur of the mountains. Others found it in the small things, a shared meal, a song around the campfire, a child's laughter echoing across the plains. They forged bonds that were strong enough to withstand the loneliness, resilient enough to endure the hardships. Their resilience became their lifeline, pulling them out of the depths of despair and guiding them towards the glimmer of hope on the horizon. In the harsh crucible of the Oregon Trail, survival was a daily victory. It demanded grit, tenacity, and an almost superhuman capacity to endure. Every sunrise was a testament to their will to live, every sunset a celebration of life. But let's face it, most people don't want to hear about grit and tenacity. Those are traits that are usually found in older folks who have lived through tough times. You might think that a life on the Oregon Trail is pretty much the same as any other, except for all the covered wagon stuff. That's where you're wrong. People who travel today are generally doing it because they want to see something or visit someone. It's not like people on the Oregon Trail who were looking for a better life somewhere else. You've probably sat around a campfire wondering how you'd fare on the Oregon Trail, whether you could handle the journey and all its challenges. Well, here's a hint. When you're traveling for months with little to no entertainment and a lot of time to think, you start to get pretty creative. Games like poker become a way to pass time and maybe win some extra cash. But when your whole world is moving at a snail's pace, even cards can seem slow. Enter storytelling. Sitting around listening to stories is a classic pastime, especially when there isn't much else to do. Stories kept the pioneers entertained, distracted from the harsh realities of their journey. They shared tales of adventure, love, loss, and everything in between. Most of the stories were made up, but some were based on real events that happened on the trail. Pioneers traded stories about daring escapes from stampedes, narrow escapes from river crossings, encounters with Native Americans, and the constant struggle against the elements. These stories served as a warning, a cautionary tale to those who hadn't yet experienced them. After all, there's a reason they say stories are the most powerful way to teach people things. If a story was good, the audience would be on the edge of their seats, hanging onto every word. Even when things were tough, people found ways to laugh. Humor became a coping mechanism, a way to deal with the stress and uncertainty of their journey. Jokes and funny stories helped to relieve tension and create a sense of camaraderie among the travelers. It wasn't always easy to be cheerful, but when people did laugh, it was a sound worth listening to. As the trek continued, the pioneers were confronted with a series of tests that not only challenged their physical endurance, but also their mental fortitude. The isolation, the monotonous landscape, and the limited distractions tested their patience and their creativity. What did they do to cope? How did they survive the mental toll of such a grueling journey? How did they keep their minds from wandering too far into the landscapes of despair? This was no Sunday stroll in the park. This was a test of human endurance. The pioneers sought refuge in the simple pleasures that life on the trail offered. For instance, fishing became more than just a means of sustenance. It was a welcome distraction from the endless road ahead. The quiet moments spent by the river's edge, the anticipation of a tug on the line, the satisfaction of a meal caught rather than bought, all these created moments of tranquility amidst the chaos. Nature provided the canvas upon which they painted their joys and sorrows. A bright sunrise became a source of renewed hope. The vast expanse of the night sky, a reminder of the wonders that still existed in the world. They documented their journey, pouring their hearts onto paper. Journals became not just a diary of their travels, but a repository of their emotions, their fears, their dreams, and their resilience. Every entry was a testament to the power of the human spirit to endure and adapt. Some found comfort in the rituals of everyday life. Cooking a favorite meal, however simple, became a celebration. A shared pot of stew, a loaf of freshly baked bread, these were more than just food. They were symbols of home and hearth, of the comforts they were working towards. In the evening, when the day's journey was done, the campfire became the center of their world. It was a place of warmth, of shared stories and songs, a place where the darkness couldn't touch them. And when the stars emerged, they found solace in their timeless beauty, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was still wonder in the world. Now, I want to hear from you. If you had to journey on the Oregon Trail, what would you take with you? Would you go? Leave your answers below. And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button so you won't miss our upcoming episodes. We've got some great stuff coming up that you wouldn't want to miss. Thanks for watching.